Before we get started, I've got a couple of trivia questions I'm going to ask. See how much Bible trivia you know. All right, you ready? I know you're excited. Bible trivia is always fun. So I'll give you the question and see if you can get the answer, and then I'll give you some hints, all right? So the first question is which is the longest gospel? Which of the gospels is the longest? Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. All right, here's my hints. You ready? Our hint. Matthew has 28 chapters. Mark has 16 chapters. Luke has 24 chapters. And John has 21. And so the longest gospel is the gospel of Luke. Luke's the longest gospel. Now Matthew's divided into more chapters, but Luke is the longest gospel. All right, second question. Which New Testament author contributed most to the New Testament? Who contributed the most content? All right, and here's my clue. All right, Paul has 13 books. John has 5. Luke has 2. Peter has 2. And then the rest just have 1. So they're automatically out of the running. All right, so who has contributed the most content? And the answer is not even a clue. Luke. That's right, Luke with 2. So you consider he wrote the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, and combined, those are longer than all of Paul's 13 letters combined. All right, so Luke wrote the longest gospel and actually contributed the most to the New Testament. All right, so turn with me to Luke chapter 22. Luke chapter 22, we're finishing chapter 22 and starting chapter 23. Now the passages that we're looking at, the verses that we're looking at are going to cover Jesus' trial. Now Luke may have written the longest gospel, but when it came to the trial, he wrote almost the least. You know, there's a lot of information the other gospel writers give us that Luke just omits when it comes to Jesus' trial. Of course, that may be good, because if he'd included everything everyone else did, his gospel would have been even longer, and it's already the longest gospel. Now, it's been pointed out that Jesus actually went through 6 different trials or hearings before his crucifixion. First, he was taken to the home of Annas. Annas was the official high priest. From there, he was taken to the home of his son-in-law, Caiaphas. Sometime along the way, Annas made the Romans mad. They removed him and put his son-in-law, Caiaphas, in place. Rome recognized Caiaphas. The Jews recognized Annas. All right, so then after going to Annas, then to see Caiaphas, he went before the Jewish high court, or the Sanhedrin. They convicted Jesus of heresy, which was a crime punishable by death. And so the Jewish leaders then took Jesus to see Pilate, who was the governor of the Roman province of Judea, that area around Jerusalem. When Pilate learned that Jesus was from Nazareth, he sent Jesus over to Herod. Herod was the ruler of the area around the Sea of Galilee. You know, one less thing for him to do, get it off his plate, send him over to Herod. But when Jesus wouldn't perform any miracles for Herod, Herod got bored and sent him back to Pilate for the final hearing. So 6 different trials or hearings. Now, many have also noted that the trial that Jesus went through before the Jewish Sanhedrin was illegal. And it broke several Jewish laws. For example, according to Jewish law, any criminal trial had to take place during the daytime. After the sun came up, it had to end before the sun came down. This one took place all night. According to Jewish law, criminal cases were never to be tried during the Passover. Well, this was during the Passover celebration. According to Jewish law, the only decision you could make on the day of the trial was an acquittal. You could say you were going to release them, but you had to wait until at least the next day if you were going to come with a guilty sentence, right? It gave you a day to think about it so that it wasn't a rush judgment. It was a day to go home and pray and think about it, and then you came back and gave a guilty verdict. According to Jewish law, all evidence that was brought had to be corroborated by 2 witnesses, at least 2. Of course, that didn't happen in Jesus' trial, and those witnesses were actually to be examined separately. You know, they couldn't be in the courtroom at the same time. You brought them in separately. That didn't happen. According to Jewish law, a witness who gave a false testimony was punished by death. Yeah, that didn't happen either. They weren't even punished, much less killed because of their false testimony. And then lastly, according to Jewish law, a trial began with evidence for the person's innocence. Before showing anything that would prove him guilty, you had to show evidence that would prove him innocent. And that didn't. You know, and I think what we see in all of this is Jesus' innocence. I mean, we know that. But that's what this trial points out, is that Jesus was innocent, that Jesus had done nothing to deserve death. But his innocence did not stop the Jews from trying him, sentencing him, and sending him to Pilate. Nor did his innocence prevent Pilate from having him crucified. Now, our passage begins after the second hearing. Jesus has gone to see Annas, he's gone to see Caiaphas, and now he's waiting to go before the Sanhedrin. So we pick up with verse 63. Luke 22, beginning with verse 63. The men who were guarding Jesus began mocking and beating him. They blindfolded him and demanded, "Prophesy, who hit you?" And they said many other insulting things to him. Now, this too is against Jewish law. They're beating him, they're giving him punishment, and he hadn't even gone to trial yet, much less received a verdict that would give him punishment, give him a beating. Now, they beat him and say, who hit you? Having blindfolded him, who do you think hit you? If you're a prophet, you should know. Do you think Jesus did know? Yeah. I mean, in other passages, we're told that he knew the minds of those around him. I think Jesus did know. What do you think would have happened had Jesus just started giving them their names, telling them what he knew about them? It would have been interesting. Verse 66, at daybreak, the council of the elders of the people, both the chief priests and the teachers of the law, met together, and Jesus was led before them. "If you are the Messiah," they said, "tell us." Now, as I mentioned, the other gospel accounts tell us that Jesus endured 3 trials. This is the third one. Luke skips ahead in this trial to the most important. He skips over those false witnesses that the other gospel writers tell us about. He's going to skip right to the most important part. The Sanhedrin had heard these false witnesses tell their lies. None of them could come up together to come up with something that could convict Jesus of. It's pretty bad, isn't it? You can make anything up you want, and you still can't come up with something against Jesus that deserved death. And so in desperation, they asked Jesus, did he think that he was the Messiah? And Jesus answered, "I tell you, if I tell you, you will not believe me, and if I ask you, you would not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the mighty God." Seeing that they weren't going to be able to come up with enough evidence to convict Jesus, they just asked him. I mean, Jesus had been ministering for over 3 years. They had heard enough from him. If there'd been anything there, they should have known it. And so they ask him, and Jesus helps them out. They hadn't been able to do it on their own, so Jesus gives them what they couldn't find on their own. First Jesus says it doesn't matter what he says because they're not going to believe it. They don't care what he says. They're not listening to what he says. Their minds have already been made up. And if he tries to defend himself by asking them a question, which was his legal right to do, they wouldn't give him an answer. And they've already proven that they wouldn't answer him. And so Jesus, once again, uses the term the Son of Man to describe himself. It was a term that he used most often in reference to himself. It's a term that came from the prophet Daniel. Daniel wrote in Daniel 7, verse 13, "In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days," that is God, "and he was led into his presence." Jesus is saying Daniel was talking about me. And then Jesus declares, "And I will be at God's right hand." Now, the right hand was a position of power, a position of authority, a position of honor. They all knew what Jesus meant. They couldn't believe his ears. Jesus had just given them all they needed in order to have him killed. But just to make sure they heard correctly, they asked him again, just wording it differently. Verse 70, they all asked, "Are you then the Son of God?" He replied, "You say that I am." Then they said, "Why do we need any more testimony? We have heard it from his own lips." Now we know that Jesus is the Son of God. We were told that from the very beginning in the Gospels. Gabriel appeared to Mary and told her in Luke 31 and 32, he said, "You will conceive and give birth to a son, and you are to call him Jesus. He will be great, and he will be called Son of the Most High." The Son of God. After his baptism, we read in Luke 3:22, "And the Holy Spirit descended on him in bodily form like a dove, and a voice came from heaven, 'You are my Son, whom I love. With you I am well pleased.'" Jesus is the Son of God. Now, the Jewish leaders didn't want to hear any of that. What do you mean, the Son of God? To hear Jesus say that made him guilty of blasphemy, which was punishable by death. Now, the Romans ruled over the Jews, and they allowed the Jews to have a certain amount of self-governing. But they didn't allow the Jews to exercise capital punishment. If they wanted to have someone killed, they had to go before the Roman government to do that. And the Roman government didn't care anything about heresy. You mean he said something about your God? So what? So they had to come up with something that the Romans did care about. Chapter 23, verse 1. "Then the whole assembly rose and led him off to Pilate, and they began to accuse him, saying, 'We have found this man subverting our nation. He opposes payment of taxes to Caesar and claims to be Messiah, a king.'" Do you hear how the charges have changed? They went from being religious to being political. They claim that he opposed paying taxes and that he was setting himself up against Caesar to be a king, both of which we know are false. Now, what's funny is I think if Jesus could have done those things, if he could have allowed the people to stop paying taxes, if he could have led a revolt against Rome and won, they would have been more than happy to have done that. They were looking for a Messiah who would lead them against Rome, kind of like the Maccabees had done almost 200 years earlier. It's just they didn't think Jesus could do it, and so they're just seeing Jesus as a threat to their positions of power, and so they accused Jesus of these things that he wasn't doing. Verse 3, "So Pilate asked Jesus, 'Are you the king of the Jews?' 'You have said so,' Jesus replied. Is it true? Pilate says, is what they're saying true? Are you guilty of these things? And Jesus just kind of nonchalantly says, yeah. And what does Pilate say? Verse 4, then Pilate announced to the chief priests and the crowd, I find no basis for a charge against him. He just admitted it, and Pilate says, yeah, he's not serious. There's nothing wrong with this guy. He's harmless. You know, Pilate could see that Jesus wasn't going to lead any revolt. Even he knew that Jesus was innocent of the charges being made against him. Verse 5. But they, the Jewish leaders, insisted. He stirs up all the people all over Judea by his teaching. He started in Galilee and has come all the way here. On hearing this, Pilate asked if he was a Galilean. When he learned that Jesus was under Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who was also in Jerusalem at that time. All right, so if the Jews were going to keep pressing this and not let it go, then just send it over to Herod. He falls under his jurisdiction. Let him take care of it. Verse 8. When Herod saw Jesus, he was greatly pleased because for a long time he had been wanting to see him. From what he had heard about him, he hoped to see him perform a sign of some sort. He plied him with many questions, but Jesus gave him no answer. The chief priests and teachers of the law were standing there, vehemently accusing him. Then Herod and his soldiers ridiculed and mocked him. Dressing him in an elegant robe, they sent him back to Pilate. That day, Herod and Pilate became friends. Before this, they had been enemies. Now, remember who Herod is. This is Herod Antipas. This is a son of Herod the Great who had tried to have Jesus killed when he was just an infant. This is the Herod that had Jesus' cousin John the Baptist beheaded. This is the Herod that Jesus is standing before. Herod's only interested in being entertained. He wanted him to do some sort of sign, a miracle. And Jesus refused to play along. He wouldn't even answer when the accusations were made against him. And so, bored by the whole ordeal, Herod turns him over to the soldiers and says, send him back to Pilate. But before they do, they ridicule him. They put a purple robe on him. Now, we don't know if they beat him. We're not told they physically struck him here, but they verbally assaulted him and then sent him back to Pilate for his sixth and final hearing. Verse 13. Pilate called together the chief priests, the rulers, and the people, and he said to them, you brought to me this man as one who is inciting the people to rebellion. I have examined him in your presence and have found no basis for your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us. As you can see, he has done nothing to deserve death. Therefore, I will punish him and then release him. Pilate's not even sure why Jesus is there. I can't find anything. Herod can't find anything. But just to appease you, I'll have him roughed up a little bit and then I'll release him. But that's not enough. Verse 18. But the whole crowd shouted, away with this man, release Barabbas to us. Barabbas had been thrown into prison for an insurrection in the city and for murder. Wanting to release Jesus, Pilate appealed to them again, but they kept shouting, crucify him, crucify him. For the third time he spoke to them. Why? What crime has this man committed? I have found in him no grounds for the death penalty. Therefore, I will have him punished and then release him. Now the conversation has gotten a little stronger. Crucify him. They didn't want Jesus. They'd rather have Barabbas. They knew why Barabbas was in prison. They knew he'd rebelled against the Roman government. They knew he'd committed murder. He deserved crucifixion. But they would rather have Barabbas and let Jesus be crucified. And when Pilate asked what he had done, all they say is, crucify him. Verse 23. But with loud shouts, they insistently demanded that he be crucified, and their shouts prevailed. So Pilate decided to grant their demand. He released the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, the one they asked for, and surrendered Jesus to their will. You know, they just wouldn't be dissuaded. They wanted Jesus crucified. They didn't just want him beaten. They wanted him killed. They wanted to get rid of him. Even though he could find no charges against Jesus that were worthy of crucifixion, Pilate gave in to the demands of the crowd in order to appease them. Pilate released Barabbas, and he turned Jesus over to be crucified. Jesus went through half a dozen trials in less than 12 hours, hearings and interviews, and the only thing we learn about Jesus from all of this is that he was innocent. That's the verdict. He was innocent. Even the manufactured witnesses could not agree to anything that would be worthy of death. And so, knowing that he was innocent, they crucified him anyway. Years later, Peter wrote in 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 22 and 23, about Jesus. He said, he committed no sin, and no deceit was found in his mouth. When they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. He entrusted himself to God, to his Father. Now, if Jesus was innocent, then why did he go to the cross? If he did nothing wrong, why did God allow his son to be crucified? I mean, this sounds like the opposite of justice, does it not? The reason Jesus was crucified is for this simple reason. He was crucified for us. Jesus went to the cross for us. It wasn't because of his sins, but because of ours. It was part of God's plan, his original plan. His plan to deal with our sin, his plan to bring us back into a relationship with him that we might have forgiveness. As Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians 5:21, God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. Jesus, who was innocent, was crucified that we might have forgiveness. He took our sin. He took our punishment. And that's what we remember. Each Easter, that's what we remember each Sunday as we gather around the Lord's table. We have forgiveness, not because of what we have done, but because of what Jesus did for us on the cross. Jesus, being innocent, went to the cross for us. He took our sins. He took our punishment. All of this happened to fulfill God's purpose, to make it possible for us to be forgiven, to make it possible for us to be reconciled, and to once again be made part of God's family. This is what the trials teach us. That we are guilty. That Jesus was innocent. And yet he took our punishment on him. We're going to sing our invitation hymn, and we invite you to come. If you've never made that decision to follow Jesus, to receive the forgiveness that is only made possible through Jesus' death on the cross, we invite you to come and be baptized in his name. You know, we celebrate It's a terrible story to read that someone was crucified, but we celebrate that though he was innocent, he willingly went to the cross for us. Won't you please stand as we sing?